So we've talked a lot about chordates in the last video, and I want to get specific about tetrapods in this video. So we mentioned that chordates with a head, with a skull, and a brain are craniates, and craniates with a vertebral column are vertebrates, and vertebrates with jaws are gnathostomes. And we talked about some gnathostomes, cartilaginous fish, chondrichthyes, and osteichthyes, bony fish, and some types of osteichthyes, ray fin fish and lobe fin fish, and a type of lobe fin fish where the pectoral and pelvic fins have evolved into limbs. So in other words, a gnathostome with 4 limbs, feet and digits, is called a tetrapod. And tetrapods are evolved for life on land, and so there are some marked differences. So those limbs have to be stronger in order to hold up against gravity, because water is a pretty buoyant medium, but air is not, right? You can stand up in water pretty easily. It holds you. You can do your slow-mo running in water, and you don't fall as quickly, right? Gravity is has more of an impact on land, and so you need stronger muscles. You also need a neck that allows separate movement from the head. You have to be able to turn around, right, and look behind you. As a fish, that's not important because you can swim around pretty quickly. You don't have gills, right, with the exception of some aquatic species. But most tetrapods don't have gills because gills are meant to get oxygen from water and get rid of CO2, whereas gas exchange with the air is going to require lungs. And you also have to have ears for detecting vibrations in the air rather than in the water. So we have something like ears to detect airborne sounds. And there's actually a pretty robust fossil record looking at transitional species between essentially lobe-finned fish that were still in the water, like lungfish or coelacanths, and tetrapods, like amphibians that were out of the water at least part-time. And one of the most important transitional organisms is called Tiktaalik, and I want you to know Tiktaalik. And sometimes this is called a fishapod because it has both fish and tetrapod characteristics. It has fins and it has gills and scales, but it also has lungs, and it has ribs that provide that structure to breathe air in the lungs and support its body. It has a neck, which allows it to turn its head, which is pretty important. And its fins are displaying the bone pattern of a tetrapod limb. So all tetrapod limbs have, so look at your own arm. We have one long bone. For us, that's the humerus. We have then 2 bones here, our radius and our ulna. And then we have a bunch of small bones where our wrist is, and then digits that come out here. Okay? These guys have that same bone pattern, Tiktaalik. And again, this is different from other fish. And all tetrapods show that same pattern. And so it seems likely that Tiktaalik, or a very close relative of Tiktaalik, is an ancestor of all tetrapods. And here you can see an image of the actual fossil, right? You can see a flat head, which is very different from normal fish. Normal fish have sort of a head that goes like this, right? Rather than a head that goes like this, which is more common in tetrapods like amphibians and reptiles. And again, a neck before you get to the shoulder bones, right? Shoulder bones that are kind of beefier and are attached to the fins. And these fins have this kind of bone structure, right? If you zoom in on that, and this looks like a tetrapod bone structure. But again, they still have scales like fish. They still have fins like fish. There's still evidence that they have gills in addition to lungs. And based on this skeletal structure, it seems likely they could prop themselves up on their fins and move a little bit, but not outright walk, right? So they may have lived in the shallows and been able to sort of scurry a little bit, but not pick themselves up and walk like a tetrapod. And the first tetrapods probably appeared about 365 million years ago. And this is a broad look at the phylogeny, looking kind of just before and just after limbs with digits, right? So we have, for instance, lungfish, which are still alive today and are fish with lungs, and they're lobe-finned fish. but they don't have these beefy limbs with digits, right? They don't have this tetrapod bone structure. But there are other fossils that do, including Tiktaalik, which is probably, at least according to the record that we have, sort of the closest to these other sort of fish-looking critters that do have limbs with digits, right? That can kind of move you a little bit. Acanthostega and Tulauriptodon. And these guys are probably a little bit closer to amphibians, which again are still alive today. These guys are not still alive today. And then amniotes, which includes reptiles, birds, mammals, and we'll talk about those shortly. So the class of chordates that includes sort of the oldest group of tetrapods that are still alive today are amphibians. And amphibians are still tied to the water, right? They tend to not be able to live a life entirely independent from the water, even if it's just where they have to lay their eggs. And it includes frogs and salamanders and a group of organisms called caecilians. And as a reminder, this is where we are right here, amphibia, right? So we've kind of talked about all these guys so far. You know, our ray-finned and lobe-finned fish, and even our sort of lunged fish and early tetrapods here. And these are the main orders of amphibians, which I want you to know. So Urodela, which is the salamanders, and Uro means tail, and so this literally means the tailed ones. Aenura, which is frogs and also toads, and that Aenura means no tail, so they're the tailless ones. And caecilians look kind of like a cross between a snake and an earthworm, but they're actually amphibians. And their order is Apoda, which means no legs, right? So they're tetrapods without any legs, even though tetrapod means 4 limbs, right? Because they evolved from ancestors with 4 limbs, kind of like snakes did, right? Snakes evolved from ancestors with 4 limbs, so we still consider them tetrapods. A lot of amphibians also, in addition to having lungs, exchange gas across their skin. So they couldn't exchange all of the gases they need, get all the oxygen they need through their skin. They need lungs, but it complements the lungs in gas exchange. And because of this, they have to have moist skin. They can't be far away from the water. And so, again, amphibian means both ways of life. Very often, they have to live in water, near water, during their whole life, or sometimes just during the beginning of their life. And so a lot of amphibians have some sort of metamorphosis. You're probably familiar with tadpoles, right? This is what frog babies look like. And they swim around and live a totally aquatic life. Over time, they grow legs, they get rid of their tail, and then they become an adult frog. And when you become an adult, what adult means in the biological sense is sexually mature, and then you're able to sexually reproduce. Now, while this may look like frogs have internal fertilization because there's a mounting process, really what happens is there's external fertilization, but the male is able to get the female to lay her eggs unfertilized right in front of him, and then he fertilizes them right after they come out. And so that's a way for him to make sure that the eggs are in fact his, if he's going to protect them. And so this is called jelly, literally, and it's just goo full of frog eggs. And these eggs have to be wet. So generally amphibian eggs have to be laid in the water or at least somewhere moist. Very often there's some level of care for the eggs, and the females will carry them on their egg, or sometimes, or on their back, I should say, or even in their stomach. But sometimes it's in their mouth, and this is a way for amphibians that may be living primarily away from the water to keep those eggs moist. So here's a look at a frog who is carrying eggs in a moist kind of pouch on her back. And again, it allows her to keep them wet so they don't dry up. In the last few decades, we've actually lost a lot of amphibians. They're sort of an indicator species that start to die off first when habitats begin to lose their ecological balance. And there are a lot of reasons for the amphibians losing biodiversity. There are some species of fungus that have gone wild and killed off a lot of amphibians. There's also been a lot of habitat loss and pollution. And again, they're more susceptible to some toxins than other organisms because of that moist skin where they exchange gases. But also climate change has really changed a lot of their aquatic habitats. So while amphibians are tied to the water for at least some portion of their life, other tetrapods obviously aren't. We are not. We need water. We need to drink water, but we don't have to live near water. We can live in dry places, as can birds and reptiles and other mammals. And we are all a group of tetrapods called amniotes. And this has to do with how we develop and some special membranes that we have as we develop. And the ancestral amniote developed an egg that essentially brought the pond with them, right? It was sealed off, so it didn't dry up, but it had all the things inside it that an organism would need to develop on land and hatch. And very early on, there was a branching between reptiles and synapsids. And this has to do with some kind of openings on the skull that we'll look at, but synapsids eventually developed into mammals. Reptiles developed into a lot of things. Diapsids, which are most reptiles, including archosaurs, which are pretty ancient, include dinosaurs and crocodiles. Now, most dinosaurs are gone today, right? But crocodiles are clearly still here. And birds are dinosaurs that are still around. So there are still archosaurs around. It's just that most of them are birds. And then the other group of diapsids are lepidosaurs, and those include tuataras and squamates. Squamates are snakes and lizards, right? So most of what we think of as reptiles. Tuataras look kind of like lizards, but they're a little bit different. And then off to the side are a group called parareptiles, which are extinct, that are pretty different from normal reptiles and are no longer around. And then we don't know where to put turtles, but they seem to be related relatively distantly to the rest of the reptiles. But the key to amniotic success is the amniotic egg, which again allows amniotes to move away from water. And it has 4 extra embryonic membranes that I want you to know: the amnion, the chorion, the yolk sac, and the allantois. And I'm assuming you're familiar with the yolk sac because, you probably all cracked an egg, and it's the yellow part. And that is full of fats and proteins, right? It's full of nutrients. And so, it's really good for you. Not too many of them. It's high in cholesterol too, but, it's full of good nutrients for you. That's what it's there for the developing embryo, right? Yolk sac provides nutrients. You may be familiar with the amnion as well. The amnion is a membrane that's full of fluid, amniotic fluid, and it essentially provides a buoyant place for the embryo to hang out, and that gives it some protection, right? So water is cushioning and absorbs some shock, and so it provides a nice floating place for them to live. But you may not be familiar with the chorion. The chorion is a membrane that allows exchange of gases, right? And here we have an area with gases, and they can exchange with the blood vessels here, the early blood vessels of the embryo. The chorion develops in us into a placenta, right, which allows gas exchange for us with our mother instead of the environment around. And the last thing is the allantois, and the allantois is this thing, and this is there for wastes, right? You put wastes from the embryo, store them in the allantois until you can leave the egg, right? Because you don't want wastes to build up where they can be absorbed back into the embryo. This becomes essentially part of our umbilical cord in humans, which is where we deposit our wastes. And then the amniotic egg also has a shell, and again is resistant to water loss. So amnion, chorion, allantois, yolk sac, and then usually a shell, although obviously we don't have a shell. And this amniotic egg came along with other terrestrial adaptations for living on land. So we have impermeable skin, right? We have keratin. There are scales on other organisms, but they prevent water loss. We have a rib cage to ventilate the lungs, and were strong to deal with gravity without the buoyant support of water.